Good evening, everyone. We are meeting with Kenny Schachter tonight, and he's in London, where it's midnight, which I guess is a little fortuitous as we just began daylight savings time here, so it made it not quite so late. I find Kenny kind of an enigma and sort of like a role model who has clearly self-defined his participation and role in the art world and is doing all different kinds of fascinating things. I'm not clear how you got to this place, though. I mean, you are in London now, but you grew up on the East Coast in Long Island. Isn't that right?
Correct. I've been in London now for about 8.5 years, going on 9 years.
You grew up on Long Island?
Did.
And are you an expatriate by definition?
I'm living in London, having left the U.S., so that would classify, yes.
Okay. Now, what did you do in the U.S.? I mean, all right. So, did you have a fairly normal childhood? And were you involved in art as a kid at all?
You're really driving back.
Yeah.
I don't know what a fairly normal. Pardon?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, part of what I want to do is
normal childhood is, but.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, it was quite isolated. I had no art exposure till much later in life.
And so you never actually fantasized about being an artist like so many people do who end up doing other things but are tangentially involved?
Well, to tell you the truth, because I was reared in the suburbs and there really was no professional art world from where I came from, even though it was about 20 miles from New York City. So there was no art world in my mind to fantasize about because I had absolutely no idea there was such a thing as the art world.
And you got a law degree ultimately?
And what they're hoping is that after
yes, I do. I studied philosophy and political science. I wasn't cognizant that there was an art world. I went to a lot of museums when I was in university in Washington, and I naively thought that art went from the studio of an artist directly into a museum. Really, the first thing about aesthetics, my first exposure was through cars in the suburbs, more industrial design than fine art, because I simply wasn't exposed to any of it.
Cars kind of relate, you know, to an extent, sort of maybe that parallels what you see in Southern California with some of those artists who began, you know, with motorcycles and surfboards and segued to fine art. You went from cars. You still have a fascination with cars.
Well, I've come full circle in a sense, because since I've been working a lot with the architect Zaha Hadid, I've curated many international exhibitions for her, both in the UK, in New York City, in Spain, and in Switzerland. And since then, I've commissioned her to design 2 cars and a boat for me, more kind of conceptual exercises than anything else.
All right, let's deal with this a little bit chronologically, and I want to get to what you were just talking about. But, all right, so you were in law school and you stumbled on art and it bit you in the ass and you've been infected ever since.
And now I just slipped a disc lifting an Ai Weiwei, so it's still attacking after all these years.
Oh, yeah, right.
Here's what happened. I was procrastinating from studying for an exam, and a friend of mine dragged me to the estate sale at Sotheby's of Andy Warhol. And for me, it was a revelation. At that point in my life, I was in my 20s. I had never been to a commercial art gallery. In fact, I didn't know commercial art galleries existed. And when I went to see the Warhol estate sale, I wasn't quite such a big fan of Warhol as much as I was trying to procrastinate from an exam. And at that time, besides selling his vast collection of contemporary art that he had largely traded for, the auction house was gearing up for a sale, an upcoming contemporary art sale. So for me to see the art that I had seen in the East Wing of the Smithsonian Museum, things like Cy Twombly, etc., being set up for an actual sale where the work was transacted, to me was shocking. I absolutely had no conception that there was a marketplace where art was bought and sold. And from the instant that I went to that exhibition, the following week I went to an art gallery and took out an unsecured loan and bought my first artworks, which were contemporary prints by Twombly, and like an idiot savant, I went automatically into dealing the works.
In a matter of minutes, right?
I'm sorry?
In a matter of minutes.
A matter of minutes.
Okay, But did you have a gallery then in the traditional sense?
Like, okay, so as I said before, I went to law school. I studied philosophy and political science. I never had the intention of practicing law. I was hiding from the marketplace because with a degree in philosophy, there's not much you could do. So when I actually took a job part-time writing for a law firm, and when I bought those two prints, I started to just immerse myself into learning about how the art. You've seen a lot of art over the time, art about museums. I had this incredible fascination, and still do, with the kind of dissemination system in the world of art, or really there's nothing like the art market. I've been involved in the stock market as a lawyer, in the fashion business, in 10 different businesses or more, and never really, it just opened my eyes. The first time I walked into an art gallery, I was seduced and repulsed instantaneously, and both at the same time, because I had never experienced such an environment where on the one side it's a business, on the other side it has an academic side to it, but the mentality I found to be really almost off-putting and offensive as much as it was enticing, and still do to this day, nearly 25 years later.
Yeah, clearly, and that's a lot of your appeal and it makes you fascinating. How did that manifest itself in, for you in business, in the art world, when your first years?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting story because when I started at the time in the 80s, there was a big boom in the contemporary art market with neo-expressionism going on. But I felt as a very late bloomer and a newcomer to the art world, I had to find an angle where I can bring something to the table to New York City and the art world. And there were so many fabulous galleries, people that have since passed away, like Pat Hearn and Colin Deland, and so many wonderful dealers in New York. And at the time, I didn't know how I can bring a fresh approach to something that seemed to be saturated already at the time. So what I started to do, having studied German philosophy and being interested in Germany in general, I took the approach of beginning to learn about art through what was happening in Cologne and Dusseldorf. And incredibly, at the time, there was no art market as we know it in the UK at the time. There was Francis Bacon, of course, and Lucian Freud, but there was largely zero contemporary art market in the UK. And I could never forget to this day, in the New York Times, on the cover of the magazine section, there was an article, New York versus Cologne, what is the center of the art market? There was that much kind of contention between the US and Germany, so I just hit the ground running. And as I took a part-time job in a law firm, in between writing major briefs, I would go to Germany and visit museums, galleries, and teach myself grassroots about art. Am I boring you?
No, I'm just fascinated. I don't think so.
Not yet.
I assembled my knowledge, chronologically back asswards, and assembled it, in that manner. All right. So then, to an extent, and perhaps to a large extent, you were perceiving a niche and looking for a niche in which to place yourself, more than necessarily at that time a belief system.
Well, I'm losing you a little bit on the last one, but what I started to do was, again, I would go to Germany, learn about art, and then I kind of did this arbitrage where I was buying very small and inexpensive. I taught myself art through drawings and works on paper, which today remain the most accessible way into the art world, because people complain so much about the big headline-grabbing prices, but art is still incredibly affordable and accessible through drawings and prints and multiples, and that's really how I taught myself. The one thing when I started, I began, after I started going to Germany and introducing myself to the work of younger artists from abroad, I was asked to curate an exhibition at the Sandra Gehring Gallery of German art, since that's where I had been spending a large part of my time educating myself. And after I curated the first couple, I'm sorry?
What year do you think that was?
I started going to Germany in the mid-'80s, bought my first piece of art in about '88, and curated my first exhibition at 1990 in New York at Sandra Gehring Gallery. Okay. But at that point, then I started curating these hit and run shows where New York was entering a really a terrible recession, even in relationship to today. In the art world, it was 10 times worse. And what's incredible to think about is how much the art world has grown since the early 90s to today. I mean, it's grown maybe 1,000-fold. When you hear today about emerging markets and global markets that predominate, Qatar was considered the biggest collector of Western contemporary art last year. When I began in the late 80s and early 90s, there was zero international emerging market participation in art. I mean, contemporary art was a very, not a tiny universe, but a minuscule universe. There was no participation by these international places. So I started once I came back from Germany, dealing small drawings and multiples to other dealers. I began to immerse myself in the local art scene by going to universities. I started teaching at the New School on probation. I had curated a half a dozen shows. I had a JD, a law degree, so I was able to get hired at the New School as on probation as an adjunct teacher, and then the dean that hired me on probation left, and I was on the books at the New School as an adjunct teacher, and from there I went on to lecture at NYU, Columbia, Rhode Island School of Design, and I'm teaching in Europe now at the University of Zurich and the Royal College of Art.
Wow. So when you're teaching in Europe, are you teaching in English?
Well, I still struggle with English a bit, as you could see. But yeah, English. And writing for magazines and newspapers, and I've contributed to a couple of books since then as well.
Why did you leave the U.S.?
I mean, I have to say I got a bit complacent and bored doing the same thing for so many years in the same place. My wife had family in Europe, so she was interested to move to be closer to her parents, and I just felt that it was a good time to make a move, and this was in 2004, so it's going on 10 years now.
And you're basically happy with it?
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I like the close proximity. I'm very involved in working still in Germany, in Switzerland, and you can hop on a train in 2 hours, be in Paris. I'll go to Cologne on Wednesday. From there, I'll go to the Maastricht Fair. And having a lot of kids and having the flexibility to get around here, I find it a lot easier and less isolated.
Okay, cool. Now, all right, so the art world, yeah, I don't know. I mean, you've anticipated the art market to a large extent ever since you jumped in, don't you think? I mean, it's not like you're responding to it per se. You're anticipating and leading.
Well, I'm not quite sure how much I'm leading in relationship to some of the other bigger players, but I'm still just fascinated on a daily basis of how this market transforms itself, who the players are and what the rules are and the regulations. There's so few regulations that govern the market, but I have to say I'm completely intrigued on it and frustrated by it, but as much today as I ever was in the beginning, even though it's such a changed universe.
Let's deal with sweeping brushstrokes from like 1990 to today. And, you know, like when you began to now, I mean, you know, you're sort of like surfing it. But it's totally, it's changed, and the waves and the players and the influences have changed. Address it.
Well, I mean, it's funny because sometimes I get into arguments with people because people say that the world has become so money focused that people say now it's at the, you know, that there are even less opportunities today than there were, say, in the recession in the early 90s, but I largely disagree with that. And as I mean, look, there's always going to be good and bad about it, and I very much believe in a trickle-down theory. Not everybody is participating at the $100 to $250 million levels of buying and selling paintings, but really, when you would have an opening in the art world in the 90s, there would be 7 people, some shitty wine, and a few cheese and crackers, and that would be the extent of it. And if you look, again, it's a shame that it's money that so predominates the discourse. I mean, economics is practically an art form today. It's not just a discourse about art and money. So much art has to do with money as its content, which is a bit disillusioning, but I really believe that it trickles down, and as the playing field has grown exponentially, it creates opportunities on so many different fronts for so many people to participate. And it's not just male artists from the U.S. in their 30s and 40s which are driving the market, although that's true still to a very disconcerting extent. There are still more opportunities for women today than ever before, even though really the price disparity between male and female is still outrageously gigantic. And nevertheless, from emerging markets like from Asia and Africa and the Middle East, there's more people playing the game than ever before at all different price levels. So I'm cynical, but I'm tremendously idealistic and excited about the opportunities that are ahead for all of us.
Is there a disconnect between the reasons that artists make art and the reason that collectors buy art?
You can't make sweeping generalizations today when it's such a big economy. So, I mean, there are some people that want to be famous for doing nothing, and there always will be. And at the same time, there are some people that make art with no regard to ever having a giant audience for it and make it for the reasons of passion and for caring about it. I mean, really, I'm involved on all sides of the coin. I admit there are some things I do that are strictly for financial gain in my participation in the art world. And there are other things that I do, the things that I care so much about, like what I'm doing right now when I should be sleeping, the writing that I do and the teaching I do largely for free, and I would continue to do so. And these are the things, speaking to people and share. So, I mean, working in the art world is like being in the mafia in a certain extent, because people have such trepidation and such fear about speaking about the most basic tenets of how this whole enterprise functions. And if you read any of the few books on the subject, from Anthony Hayden Guest wrote a book called True Colors, or Sarah Thornton wrote a book, 7 Days in the Art World, and really there's very little relevant and entertaining or insightful information that you can glean from any of these books. And I think people on my side that are very involved on the transactional level are very reticent to talk, because I could be very self-sabotaging if I'm revealing the machinations of some business deal that goes awry, or talking about the percentages and how these things actually function. But I almost feel compelled to share the information with people because there's no other place to get this information.
Oh, that's really true. Where do you want to go from here?
I'm at your disposal. I'm here.
What's the breakdown of mostly you're doing secondary market sales and some primary market acquisitions?
Well, I have to say, I mean, for the first 15 years of my career, if someone said the word Warhol, I would run 20 miles. I refused to get involved with any secondary market stuff. I really felt that I had to earn my stripes and really learn as much as I could possibly learn. I mean, I've made art myself and had exhibitions, and like I said, I've written about it and taught it. So for the first 15 years of my life, I only ever helped to create markets for art for emerging artists, with creating a platform for either unaffiliated artists, artists with no galleries, or mid-career artists who had had opportunities fallen through the cracks and had either lost a market or never had a market. So for the first, I'd say, half of my career, it was only in the primary market with artists that had little, if any, market. When I moved here 9 years ago, and the exchange rate between the dollar and the pound, it was more expensive to bring the box here than to sell what was inside them. And I was actually, you know, I have to say, I'm someone who sells art to make a living, but I hate it. I mean, I'm the worst art dealer you're ever going to meet. I'm my worst enemy, and I derive very little enjoyment from doing it. Over the years, I did a kind of reversal from what most people in my profession would do. I went from only working with the young kids or mid-career artists to stumbling backwards. And what happened was, when the market went crazy between 2004 and 2007, I drifted into the world. I got bored, basically, because, I mean, when I was a lawyer, I ran away from, art became bigger than the big business that I was running away from. And I went into the world of design and started to introduce, I commissioned the architect Zaha Hadid to make some materials, some works that were somewhere in between architecture, design, and functional objects. So after the market tanked, there was a short-lived recession in the fine art world between 2008 and 2010. And during that point in time, one of my clients asked me to help to sell a Monet painting. And it took about 5 years of trying to sell that painting, often terribly terrible, burning it or offering it around too much, before I really learned the ins and outs of that business. Working in the Impressionist and modern field is like learning another language. So really it was starting anew, and once I got the gist of it and started to have more success in that arena, I was able to pull back from having to sell the work of young artists, focus more on selling modern and impressionist artists, and then I could pay more attention to writing and teaching.
All right, so we're talking to a group of artists here. What do you think the most significant things are that artists need to do besides make good work?
As an emerging artist, someone trying to establish a market, is that what you're talking about?
Well, yeah, that's predominantly what we're talking about here, but we're also talking about artists who've had some museum exposure, not all, but some who've had museum exposure and haven't ratcheted it up much beyond, to the next level from that. But I don't think that the answers are really different to me.
No, I mean, I just think it's a very fickle world and a very difficult world. In a strange way, as the market gets bigger and bigger, it's a smaller and smaller group of artists that are getting celebrated. And the things that seem to be selling the most are obvious things by obvious people. It's kind of if you really look at it in a reductive way and follow the auctions, the day sales, the night sales, and what sells, you could get very depressed about it because really, I mean, I just gave a lecture for the University of Zurich, and it was on the 6 hours on the subject of pricing and how art is priced and how markets are constituted. And I have to say, it's a very, very difficult world. I mean, in the very early stages of a career, it's the gallery or who's showing the work, which even has as much, if not more, relevance than the actual work that's being sold. So, I mean, it's the obvious things of getting the work out to as many people as possible, staging exhibitions, whether it's yourselves or with galleries, and trying to get footholds into international markets and auction houses. I mean, again, it's a very, very I find selling even a Gerhard Richter, who is the most expensive living artist today, even selling material like that is incredibly hard today. Even selling a Monet is a very difficult thing, unless you're Sotheby's or Christie's or one of the major players. So in a way, the world grows bigger and bigger, but the focus is on fewer and fewer. So it's not easy, I have to say. It's still not easy, even for someone like me who's been doing it for nearly 25 years. I don't want to sound like Dr. Gloom.
That's all right. I'm working on a series of tough love talks. I don't know where to go with it. How do artists get out, beyond, how do artists get international acclaim? How do artists, I mean, I take a look at certain kinds of formats, reviews, different discussion series, I guess that's how I want to go to the question, though. How do artists get to an international level?
Well, I mean, it's the same types of thing. The internet, no one's really cracked art and the internet. There's not one predominating website or platform on the internet where people can use to expose their work. I mean, there's the obvious Facebook where we've met and Instagram and these types of things, but I think it's a relentless pushing and pushing and pushing, whether it's publishing your own little magazines or staging. I mean, I staged my own exhibitions for 15 years, literally trading things for spaces in the most basic and grassroots way, where I myself sat the gallery for 10 to 12 hours a day for 7 days a week until I got to the point where I learned another skill that would afford me the opportunity to do some of the more interesting aspects, I feel, of what it is that I'm doing. But it's just a constant, never-ending struggle of whether it's through teaching, through staging exhibitions with friends, and borrowing, stealing mailing lists from galleries, and this kind of do-it-yourself mentality is really all there is, by banding together with other like-minded people and trying to push your work out to as many facets. I mean, it's incredible just from something as stupid as you could say as Facebook, which my kids stuck me on in 2008, and I must have received about 5 or more writing opportunities in very credible newspapers and magazines, not to mention a couple of sales that have come through the constant blogging and exposure that you can achieve on something as simple as Facebook. So you can't underestimate these types of vehicles to continue to push and make work and have it exposed in such a fashion. So there is hope.
Do you think that the reasons that people buy art has changed? I mean, I saw a statistic recently that 50% of the people The European art consultant said 50% of their sales were for investment.
You know, I mean, I write for an economist in Switzerland, and the whole art as an asset class is clearly, it's something, that's one of the big manifest changes in the past 15 years in the art market. When you have people like Leon Black, who's a famous investor, spending $120 million on a screen, I doubt he's doing it to impress his friends at a dinner party. I mean, in a way, that's a paradigm shift in how art and money are going to bed together. Art and money have always been happy bedfellows. I mean, there's a book by Svetlana Alpers, who's a Columbia-based art historian, called Rembrandt's Enterprise, and he was as obsessed with money as half the people that you see in today's marketplace, like Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons. And Rembrandt bid up his own prints at auction, and he was so obsessed with money, his students painted coins on the floor in an effort to get him to bend down and try to pick them up and pocket them. So you can never really pinpoint why people collect art. You can't make sweeping generalizations. I mean, I looked at 100 different places to live before I moved to where I am living now in London, and you would go into houses and see houses that had the stable of artists from gallery X, Y, and Z. And of course, some people do it for social cachet, some people do it for investment, some people do it, but there'll always be a core group of people that do it for love and passion. And I mean, even today with the crazed market, what people don't realize when they read about these paintings selling for upwards of $250 million, people don't realize that it's still an extraordinarily illiquid investment, and unlike many other, it's not a share, and it's an incredibly difficult thing to sell. And when you get involved at certain levels, like the Andy Warhol market and these types of things, there's a cabal of people that have an inordinate amount of influence and control over the market. So you have to be a lot more savvy than a lot of other businesses due to the degree of unregulation in the market, say, and manipulation.
And oh, my bells are ringing. So you work in a lot of different directions simultaneously. I don't think anybody's ever accused you of focusing.
Thank you. You sound like my wife now.
Yeah. So artists, how do you should artists focus, or many artists want to be working in several directions simultaneously? Can you extrapolate from yourself, or are you the anomaly?
Well, I mean, I have to say, reading Karl Marx, I remember in economics in university, said, why can't you be an economist in the morning and a fisherman in the afternoon? And I've always based my life on pursuing the things that I care about most, because that's what you apply yourself to. But I remember a friend of mine sitting next to the head of the Basel Art Fair Committee saying something to the effect, who the hell do I think I am, that I could be a writer one day, an artist another day, and an art dealer the next, and that it would be absurd for me to think I ever had a chance to get into some of these high-end fairs because of this kind of dilettantist nature of how people perceive what it is that I do. I always believe in quality, that quality overrides everything, and if you do good art, good projects, I mix design in my fine art exhibitions. I've written for car magazines, and I've written for GQ, and I've written for fine art magazines. And really, I just believe in doing projects that engage myself, that I hope and trust that others will be interested in. And again, as an artist trying to get started and trying to create a market, of course, it helps to be focused and to be single-minded, because unless creating a market is probably one of the most, it's harder than inventing the wheel. It's almost a near impossible task today because of the narrow-mindedness of people that are playing the auction game and the money game in art. I mean, the actual process of making art, caring about it, exhibiting it, and writing about it is something that's entirely different from this whole universe of kids that you see at auction today from 25 to 50 years old, selling from $50,000 to $5 million. I mean, I can't explain it. I can give you the ingredients of what makes a market and all of these things that lend to some of these crazy prices, but I can explain to you the quality and the depth and innate value of a Picasso from 1934, but when there's a 40-year-old artist selling for over $1 million, it becomes a little bit more different, a little bit more difficult. And I mean, you see that a lot of this generation of people, the names you read about getting exhibitions at the Whitney Museum and reaching these prices at premature ages, and when these artists are, you end up competing with things like a Leger and Picasso works on paper and Miro, it becomes inexplicable to a certain extent. I have to say, a lot of it is fashion. If you go to some of these art fairs, there's the Armory in New York that just opened. If you go to the Frieze Fair in the UK specializing in emerging art, I say fully 90% of that material will have no value in 5 years from now.
I mean, there's certainly plenty of artists we can remember who were hot in 1988, 1990, Jed Garrett, and, you know, we can wonder where they are now.
Well, I mean, in a way, you hope that there's some kind of a meritocracy with art, because you look at people, I mean, I'm not going to pass judgment. I showed an artist, Wade Guyton, in 1997. I couldn't give his work away, and now he's just made $1.1 million. So is that a valid price? Is that a price that would be supported? I mean, art is a slow-burning process.
Did you want to answer that question? We should leave it open-ended.
I'm sorry?
We should leave open-ended our evaluation of Wade Guyton.
Well, I'm just saying that $1.1 million is a lot of money for a 40-year-old kid. Even though I worked with him and appreciated his work in the 90s, I mean, that's a lot of money. And does any artist a certain age warrant such a high price? It's hard to say. The market speaks for itself, and that's the judge of value. But let's just say in 5 years or 10 years, there's a lot of revision that will be happening. I think the market is in. I don't believe there's a bubble in the art market. All of these wacky prices, they're not driven by people taking out massive loans. It's not a debt-driven market. So there are still a lot of inordinately wealthy people in the world. And I don't think that a Picasso will ever go down more than 5 or 10% if there's a catastrophic, you know, act of terrorism or economic downturn worse than we're experiencing now. But I think what we'll see in the future are pockets of recessions within overvalued or undervalued artists. So I don't think a Gerhard Richter, Picasso, or Miro are ever really going to. I mean, I love art, and I put anytime, if I make $5, I put 7 into art. If I make 7, I put 12 in. I really believe so profoundly in the quality and inherent value of art, but I believe that the market is very fickle, and there's a lot of correction that's going to happen over the next 10 years.
If you took all the dollars assigned to individual works of art by all artists, Richter and Picasso would be at the top, right?
Go ahead.
I'm just wondering how come. I mean, I think Richter's a fabulous artist, but he wouldn't be one of the top 10 most I mean, as prolific as he is, as large a supply as he is, that the prices are so high. You know, I mean, I think he's maybe he's more valuable than if you owned all Richter inventory, you know, public and private. If you owned that, wouldn't that be worth more than all Picasso inventory? And
you're losing me a little bit, but let's say last year, Andy Warhol was the most selling artist in the market. He eclipsed Picasso for the first time, but that's simply for the reason
but there are a larger number of Picassos than there are of Warhols.
No. There are 50,000 Picasso works of art, probably approximately in existence, including paintings, drawings, prints, ceramics, multiples, etc., etc. With Warhol, there's 100,000 with Warhol. Prints, Polaroids, again. So these types of things, really, I think part of Gerhard Richter's, if you, again, like I love art and I could speak passionately about art and the content and quality of art, but if you want to reduce it to these kinds of money questions, I'm happy to speak, but don't judge me for my answers, because I'll tell you that Gerhard Richter makes 2 strains of work. There are the abstract paintings that are very seductive and jewel-like and beautiful and very identifiable as such. If you are a collector and you want to have a fabulous giant Richter and want all your friends to know that you paid $20 million for it, they're a market, an artist that makes people say Damien Hirst is mad for creating 3,000 of the same painting. But I have to say, when it comes to pure naked economics, it's better to have 3,000 of the same thing than 30 masterpieces, because people want what their friends have. People want like quality things, and that's how you judge a value in this type of market. But Gerhard Richter has a serious critical side where he's made these photorealistic paintings of the Baader-Meinhof group or World War II buildings or soldiers. And then on the other hand, he has this other side, which are these very colorful, palatable things. And then if you want to get a little more into detail, I don't know if you do, but there's been a very huge issue in the coming years in the art market will be issues of authenticity. And the Warhol Board has abandoned their authenticity committee. Basquiat, who died at 27, 28, he had 10,000 pieces of art, which largely contributes to his monstrous market today. But the one thing back to Gerhard Richter is, as a very Germanic and systematic person, he numbered every piece of art he ever made since the 60s, and there's a website, gerhardrichter.com, and you can literally search every painting the man has ever made. And number one, it's not as many as you would think, and number two, it obviates the need for the first time in history of an authenticity committee, because not even Gerhard Richter can copy some of his Gerhard Richter abstractions. And you can go to this website and look up 247-6, which is one of the poetic titles of one of his paintings, and you'll find that very painting and its provenance, etc. So in the future, issues of fakes and authenticity will have a tremendous impact on some of these very issues we're talking about.
That's totally true. I mean, yeah, people, because they can litigate about it too, you know, if they don't like the answer that the authenticating committee delivers. Somebody asked a question, and then let's open this up to folks who, you know, who haven't spoken yet. What are the ingredients, components of an art market?
A buyer and a seller, I would guess, on the most basic level. But it's, I mean, again, you would hope that art is more than just promotion and hot air. Underlying all of this stuff, you have to, I mean, I would always say that it's easier to sell the 1,237th spot painting by Damien Hirst than it is to sell an unknown masterpiece for $5,000. Again, like anything, it's a very, very hard thing to do, is to get a market moving. So the main ingredient is exposure. It has to get seen. The work has to be seen by as many people as possible. There has to be a critical response. Newspapers and magazines and on the internet really is a democratizing factor. And even though, like I said, there's not one great portal for art to disseminate art or communicate about art, things like Facebook, like Jerry Saltz on Facebook, has changed the face of art criticism. He has 40,000 people following him on Facebook, and I don't think there's ever been an art critic in history that had that kind of attention and scrutiny and audience. So these things really can make a difference, and I'm hopeful that in the next 5 years, something's going to explode on the internet front that's going to give people an incredible new way to present their work to the widest international group of people possible. I sound like I'm running for office.
You guys, raise your hands. So let me see who's got something to say. Yeah, right. Come on.
Come on, I'm boring myself.
I knew Ken would. Go ahead, Ken.
Hi. Hello, Kenny. I'm a Ken also. So I see two veins here, so I have kind of two questions. There's art and money, and there's art and purpose. As two different things. I'll start with purpose. And we've been talking about artists wanting to get into an art market of their own. And you look back on the history of art movements or different artists who've really taken off. There's often been some kind of a philosophical movement that was concurrent with it. There was a project of ideas, even Warhol. These days, I don't see a lot of artists really feeling comfortable having a philosophy that's moving their work. I don't see any art movements that are propelled by a certain philosophy that has true purpose or interest. So that's one question. If you think that's an issue, and then later on, if there's time, if you'd like to talk.
Let's do it one at a time, Ken. Okay?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well, I mean, there's always an underlying meaning to everybody's art. Everyone has an intent, whether it's a social, political, philosophical. I mean, a lot of the times what you see are simply formal considerations where, like we mentioned, the painter Wade Guyton, who had a big show at the Whitney recently, and in a sense, what is he doing? Let's dissect it. He's extrapolating images that he finds aesthetically pleasing from books, whether it's a letter like the letter X or the back of a book jacket. And for me, that work is very formal and they're really considerations of technology and using the biggest printer and taking this very simple image and letting the printer splodge it up or make little mistakes in the process. But so in one sense, right now there's an exhibition at the New Museum in New York called 1993, and it's largely focusing on a Whitney biennial back in the early 90s. And I remember seeing the show and everybody was raising their hands, screaming and yelling that it was 90% political in nature. And now we look back at those days as being so quaint when art actually had a meaning and felt that it could make a difference and make a change. Sadly, so much art today is about the fabrication qualities, the production finish, and using new video technologies or computer technologies. So, I mean, there's always a conceptual underpinning to art. Even a beautiful painting of a flower has some meaning of life or death or whatever. So I don't think art has lost its meaning. I just think that art is a little bit lost in a sea of money obsession. I mean, when I see things like, you know, art adorned with diamonds becoming these kind of tchotchke jewelry pieces, it's depressing, but it's a symptom of our times, and we're all guilty. We're all obsessed with I mean, there's one artist there's very few living artists that I continue to work with and have strong, one of them is Vito Acconci, who is a conceptual artist and video artist from the late 60s, who's doing design right now, and he's been called like a lifestyle of the poor and famous. He lives in an aesthetic existence, no real market to speak of, even though he's had retrospectives at the Museum of Modern Art, at the Stedelijk, and all over the world, and he's never followed a path where he's given the market what they want, which is more of the same. So art is still being made for all reasons, from the base and the kind of sad focus on just pure money for the sake of money, to people that espouse philosophical, social, and political ideals.
Thank you. Yeah, and the other question I had, which you started leading into because we came back to money, has to do with money and art. And from what I understand, some of the first art or use of symbolism by humans going back maybe 70,000 years or more ago were some kind of arrowheads or something, but they were not used. They were traded like money. And these were artifacts that people traded. And there was some jewelry maybe that did this also, some necklaces. So the first art starting out for us had this kind of purpose. And although some of the other earliest art a little later on, there's evidence it was shamanistic as well and took on other meaning. So I was wondering if you have any ideas about whether this is a big part of art, even though it will have its shamanistic or philosophical values. It will continue to evolve to be a monetary system and maybe even get bigger in that way for our future as a species. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I agree. I mean, that's the biggest change I've seen in my life. When I started in art and when I curated my first shows, I was running around in a pair of shorts, and if I was able to sell a piece of art for $500 or $1,000, I consider it a victory. And when today, I used to lecture at the New School, I used to write for local magazines and trade. I mean, their art magazines are dead. Art critics are dead. The new art magazines are the FT, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. It really has been a monumental and a sea change where, I mean, you look at the way art trades, it's a portable thing, it's a portable asset class, it's looked upon, you could sell it into pounds and euros and dollars, and whereas I used to lecture for a bunch of kids or people getting credit in continuing education departments at the New School for Social Research, now I find myself speaking to wealth management companies, bankers from Morgan Stanley and Coots, and even accounting firms. It really is another world. And one of the lectures I just gave was to a graduate class in art market studies. I mean, it sounds like a giant oxymoron or something from Saturday Night Live, but if there weren't these crazy prices in the headlines, these departments wouldn't exist. I wouldn't have an audience of people in these lectures if people weren't sucked in by these big numbers. So on one level, it's a great thing because really in the biggest sense, it just means that there are big financial broad opportunities for the sake of art and for people that are interested. On the negative side, I mean, people's attention span to discover new material or to care about anything other than the obvious seems to diminish all the time, and it just gets utterly depressing. And you look at these multinational companies and you look, I mean, if you really want to find out about what's happening, what really happens behind the scenes with an art dealer or an art business, the only way to find out is to read the depositions in the latest lawsuits, because that's the only way you're really going to find out any information about what's happening. And there was a piece recently where a partner at Goldman Sachs investment banking company quit the firm, and he did so through an op-ed article he wrote for the New York Times, largely complaining about how the culture changed from working with your client to nurture the growth of a client, and how it's all about today just garnering bigger and bigger fees for the bankers. And in a sense, that's the art world is really mirroring the general economy as a whole. It gets bigger and more interconnected internationally, but the interest, people, I mean, if you have a collector who doesn't you find a collector who's never resold something on a certain level, you could put them in a vitrine in a natural history museum. Collectors really don't even exist the way they used to exist in the old school way of people loving something and building it up incrementally. Now you have these idiots falling over each other at an art fair, buying art using their ear instead of their eyes, and making their mind up in a fraction of a second. Art is about learning, and it's a lifelong process of teaching yourself. And when it takes on the characteristics of a commodities trading floor, you're bound to lose something. That
Yes,
would sound
indeed.
like a miserable cynic, but
Nah, you're just a little bit realistic. Thanks, Ken. Michael Finnegan, go ahead.
Hi. Hey, thank you very much for speaking with us. This is really exciting to me. I gather from what you said, if you want to know the art world in a larger sense through, say, Bloomberg or Wall Street Journal, but what kind of blogs and Facebook pages and stuff do you read to get nurtured?
well, that's a very good question. There's one site called, God, because I'm always just logging onto it. Let me escape this and get artsjournal.com or artsjournal.org. And
Okay.
that's a fantastic site that culls all the newspapers and magazines all over the world and picks up articles from the financial to the pure art for art's sake. So, I mean, there's things like artinfo.com, galleristnewyork.com.
Well, I put a list on the private Klein-Artist-Works gang Facebook page today, and I forgot the first ones that Kenny mentioned are on there. New York Gallerist is not. That's a good site too. Keep going.
The Art Market Monitor is a one that's, again, very business-oriented, but I find to be a very helpful and interesting site. I mean, artnet.com had one of the great magazines, and they pulled the plug on it. I used to write for it as well, unfortunately. But if you want, what I could do is I can email you my full list tomorrow or tonight, and then you could post it to your viewership. But even
do that. I'd love that.
I mean, the ones I complain about also, like the FT on the weekend has an incredible arts coverage. It really does. And the New York Times on Friday, they're all free on the internet. The FT, Georgina Adam writes on the market, but they have great fine arts coverage.
Times.
Correct. And on Bloomberg.com, they have a section called the Muse, M-U-S-E, which is also free. The Wall Street Journal charges for that. I mean, I'm very democratized in my search for information, and all of the sites I go to are free. And I would say that the artsjournal.org or .com, I'll get it, is probably my favorite and the most thorough reaching of all the sites.
Wow, well, thank you very much. That's exciting to hear.
My pleasure. And if anyone has any further follow-up questions down the road, you can always find me through Paul or on Facebook or anywhere. And I always believe, I feel compelled to share the information, because when I was starting and I came to it so late, nobody would open their mouth and no one really tells you anything. And even though, like I said before, I've come to the point of sabotaging my own deals, because I just feel that people have a right to know how the business works, how the commissions work, how the relationships work on every level, whether you're selling a painting for $1,000, which I still do, or $100 million.
That's why we love you. All right, let's take a girl here. Diane, your turn. Go ahead. Diane.
Hi, Kenny. Thanks for joining us, getting up in the middle of the night. I'm here. Oh,
Where are you?
Good. Oops. She said, hold on, and then she went away. I'm unmuting you again. Are you back? Are you here?
I'm here. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead, Diane. All good.
Hi, Kenny. Thanks for joining us, getting up in the middle of the night to be with us. I have a question about auction houses online in the U.S. Do you know of any reasonably priced and reliable auction houses to buy artwork online?
That's a great question. I mean, there's always, of course, the obvious choices of Sotheby's and Christie's and Phillips, and there's Bonhams and there's Swan. I mean, the Metropolitan Museum just bought a David drawing for $840 from Swan. So,
what do you think that thing is worth?
Pardon?
What do you think that thing is worth? It's gorgeous.
A few quid more than $840, I'd say.
Go figure.
The auction house is just like the guy. Again, like when you look at something like Damien Hirst, the fake ones are as real as the real ones are fake. When you think about it, there's such a racket in how these things are produced and so forth. But these issues of the confidence in buying are going to be the most crucial issues that the art world will face in the next 50 years. So I don't know enough about, I mean, because I'm now Europe-based, I know about Lempertz and some of the German houses, but even there's been cases where these small auction houses have tried to shirk their responsibility for selling fake material. So it's such a minefield. I mean, when you look at someone like Warhol, when the estate decided to sell 20 or 30,000 pieces or more over the internet through Christie's, and they really sell for all levels. I mean, you could buy stuff for $300, $500. That, to me, is one of the purest senses of confidence in this kind of growing together of the internet and the art market, because there are great regional houses all over the world, but you really have to do your due diligence. And even some of the best of them with the best intentions will F you on a deal, because it's an impossible, if art gets matriculated, even the worst fakes end up with stickers on the back from Sotheby's, Christie's, and some European museums or whatever. I mean, I think every great museum from the Metropolitan to MoMA is filled with 10% fakes, at least. There's just no way around it. So regional auction houses, also if you're trying to start a market in your own work, I mean, today more than ever, you have artists dealing directly with the auction houses and putting their own works into auction. And again, if you find a credible auction house that you trust and have local experience with, why not? They have great Rolodexes and great access to great people. The only problem is with auctions, the way you get an auction house, and the way you get people excited during the course of a given auction, when they're not guaranteed by third parties or manipulated by the Mugrabis and these big families that participate so heavily, the way to do it is to have a very low estimate. So when you bring a piece into auction with a low estimate, you have to get two people excited to buy something, and that normally helps to precipitate a good sale, but you also risk the work not selling. And with the bigger houses, the record lasts, it has a larger shelf life, and it has to be carbon-14 dated, because auction history remains on the internet forever. So in my personal business, I use the auction houses to gauge information and for price research, but I very rarely ever buy or sell at auction. Although on the other hand, I'm very interested in going to fairs all over the world, because people will bring out the greatest art for Basel. I'm going to Maastricht later this week, and people will bring out great pieces, but there's no public history of it. And they vet the pieces, and they often have great processes to weed out the bad or the inauthentic.
That was really insightful. Thank you. John Edding, go ahead, John. I'm trying to unmute you, John. You go ahead and unmute yourself. Not working.
No.
Try again. I'm ready to give up.
I could use this as an excuse to get
There
out.
he goes. Go ahead, John. Sorry, Kenny, no excuses. John, go ahead.
Oh, you talking to me, Paul?
Well, now you're not muted anymore, but I still can't hear you. All right, C. I'm going to go to C and see if John can work this out. Go ahead, C.
Hi, Kenny. Thanks for being with us.
A little louder, girl.
Okay. Thanks for being with us, Kenny. Is that better?
Yeah.
Much better.
Okay. I'm going to ask a little more obscure question. Do you think that there is a place in the art world for art that is addressing questions of spirituality and the sacred? Or, I mean, you were talking about people being a little bit more into materials, and I know that's kind of hard to address without seeing the artwork, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's an American artist who I was involved in organizing an exhibition at the Reina Sofia Museum, and he died in the 80s, and his name was Paul Thek, T-H-E-K. And actually, the Whitney did a show a few years ago, and at the time there were no English language books of his art at all, and he was largely an artist that was supported by other artists and some international curators. But Christianity was a very predominant role in the nature of his work, even though it was his own personalized and obscure version of the religion. But I mean, as you could see that I'm kind of, like I said, I'm cynically idealistic, but I just believe anything that you care about and anything done well is art, and it's your art. So anything that moves you, whether it's spirituality or any types of issues, everything is valid and everything goes. I mean, it's an open playing field, even though maybe you'll make it a little more difficult for yourself if you're not playing into the mainstream of where people's predominant interests align. By all means, one should pursue anything they really care about, but with the full notion that you probably have to work that much harder to get your point across.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. You good, C?
John?
I'm going to take that as a yes. Thank you. John, can we unmute you? Is that going to work? Go ahead, John. Not happening.
I'm surprised I managed. I never even made a Skype call before.
And now you're a pro.
A pro.
All right, we could wrap this up. We got time for one question, maybe two, if anybody wants to. There's a hand. Wait, that's C's. Anybody else have a question? John, I can't hear you. So, do you see your involvement has been continually morphing? What's on the horizon? Let's wrap it up with this.
Can you hear me now?
All right, we'll get to my question later. Yeah, John, take it away. John.
The most highly anticipated.
I heard you ask if I could hear you, John. Say something.
Hear me, Paul?
Yes, this better be a good question. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Well, it is. I hope it is. As an investor, you got to say to yourself, everything you've been talking about would tell you to stay out of this market. There's no logic going on. It reminds me of things that happened in the derivatives market the last few years. How is it, if you're an investor, not an artist, what's the difference between, why is it a good time to invest in art now when it just seems to make no sense? That's the simplest way I can put my question.
Tough one. The last question is the hardest. I believe again, I talk very frankly about the nature of my business and how illiquid it is, how it's easy to get in because you just say, I'll buy it. it's a great business. You could walk into an art fair. You don't need any money. You don't need any identification. You walk in, you shake a hand, and you walk out, and an invoice comes in the mail, and that's your art piece. But even though I sound like a terrible person who hates the art market and everything I do, I literally believe that there will be more opportunities in the next 10 years. We're going to be facing one of the biggest bull markets in the history of art since art came off the cave wall. And I'm trying to be very frank and reasonable about the processes involved and the degree of due diligence that's required to participate. But I really feel there's more opportunities today than ever before, even at these levels, namely because there's so many more people that are buying and selling and collecting art than ever before in history. So the thing is, if you talk about derivatives for interest, for example, or shares or bonds, when you buy something, there's always someone on the other side of a transaction, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to know more than you do, or they're certainly going to know a lot. So really, art, like every business, today more so than ever, you need to have your nose against the screen. Whether it's your Bloomberg screen, your computer screen, or your art magazine, nothing will ever equate going to see art, looking at art, touching it, kicking the tires, reading about it. It's a never-ending process. And when you go to the fairs, every week there's another fair, for better or worse, or there's another auction. And fairs and auctions are by far the very, very best places to see art. I mean, I used to live in New York City. In 45 minutes, you could see 150 art galleries. In London, you could drive for 4 days and see 3 galleries because they're so diffuse and spread out. But nothing in the world beats the experience of standing in front of a work of art, whether it's at the Metropolitan Museum, Sotheby's, or the Basel Art Fair, or any other art fair. So really, I invest all of my assets in art, all of the time, simply because I'm constantly looking, constantly reading and learning, and feeling comfortable in my choices that audiences will grow as they continue to do so. But when you look at things like interest rates at a few points at best, hedge funds used to be the biggest trend, and now if a hedge fund is down 2% or up 1%, it's considered a grand slam. And all of these fundamental economic reasons of currency uncertainty, sovereign problems, banking problems, they all make art look to be a better and better and a more seductive place to keep money. But it's the same with any business there is. I mean, you can stand in front of 10 pieces of art and spend $100,000. If you have bad information, you could be left with nothing but the scrap value of the material from which you've just paid $100,000. If you're directed, if you have good information, and then you should always buy what you love. And I have no faith whatsoever in these things called art funds. I think it's an abomination. It's asinine. To divorce art from the aesthetics is one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever heard in my life. I mean, the whole thing of even investing in art is it kicks off a visual dividend. I mean, I always used to joke because working with so many young artists and young emerging artists could be so desperate and so difficult and needy when you're trying to help day in and day out. I always used to say that these artists behave as if they're curing a disease. And now they've actually done physiological and neurological studies where living with art can actually make you live longer. So maybe these artists were right half the time, but I believe, again, that it's like anything. You really, really, really have to know what you're buying, from who you're buying it, what the right price is, and collecting art is a chore. You're really nothing more than a custodian for the work to ensure its well-being. And there are issues of conservation. Some of the materials that contemporary artists use today are so much, there are more issues with some contemporary art than old masters. So it's really, sure, there's a lot of issues at stake, but I believe if you want to use it as a pure investment, you can make money as long as you know you have to be in it for the long term. You can never get in and out as quickly as you would like to. There's high transaction costs, but I don't believe that there's any other sector in the international markets today where you could make the kinds of returns that art could offer if you're astute enough about it. Not that you're not.
Whew. Awesome. You have shared a ton, there's an adjective that goes in front of ton, you've shared a ton of information with us this evening. I'm dedicated and appreciative. I think this has been really awesome. I'll send you a recording tonight, Kenny, or when you see, you can watch yourself in the morning and see how damn good you were.
I don't know if I could bear it, but
I know it's hard. I got used to watching.
Once you turn me off, once you wind me up, it's hard to shut me off.
Yeah, well, I'll shut you off. Everybody's unmuted. Thanks for it, Tom. That was awesome. Thank you.
Listening.
Thank you very much, Kenny.
Kenny.
Everybody.
Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.